Neuvillette and Kazuha's rerun has emerged, so with this arrival, let's go ahead and talk about Neuvillette's kit, his best builds, and his teams, and how to play him in certain rotations. Firstly, let's discuss his role in the game. So Neuvillette's primary role in this game is to be a main DPS. Primarily, all of his damage that he deals is on-field damage, so you usually want to build teams around him where you are buffing or giving him some form of defensive utility. For his kit, get into his normal attacks first. He has a regular 3-hit combo. With his charge attack, it takes up to 3 seconds to charge up. Then it becomes a charge attack Equitable Judgment. Now this charge attack lasts 3 seconds, consumes 8% of his max HP every half second, if he is above 50% of his max HP, which does mean that you can consume up to 48% of his max HP in this way. And through this charge attack, he can deal up to 8 instances of damage. Now, if there are droplets that are created from his elemental skill or his elemental burst, then each one can be consumed to decrease the charge attack formation time by 1 second. This means that at most he can consume 3 droplets for every charge attack that he does. And each droplet that he picks up heals him for 16% of his max HP, which means that he can heal up to 48% of his max HP. Now, if you release the attack button before the seal fully forms, then he'll just do a regular charge attack animation. However, if you do fully form the seal and you release the attack button immediately after doing so, then you can actually get the charge attack off sooner than usual. For his passives, his Ascension 1 passive grants him the Pass Draconic Glory stack when a Hydra-based reaction is triggered. Now, this includes reactions like Vaporize, Frozen, Electrocharged, Bloom, a Hydro Swirl, or a Hydro Crystallize. And every stack lasts 30 seconds and is independent to each reaction that is triggered, capping at 3 stacks. Now, this does mean that you have to trigger 3 separate reactions to get 3 stacks at max. So you can't use the same reaction to trigger multiple stacks. They're independent of each. And each stack increases his charge attack Equitable Judgment's damage by 110, 125, and then 160% of its original damage. Now this is a base damage multiplier, which means that it is directly multiplicative of his base damage. So this works similarly to characters like Yoimiya, Farina, and Navia with their elemental skills that also increases the base damage of their skills. For his Ascension 4 passive, so Neuvillette gains a Hydro damage bonus based on each percent of his current HP that is above 30% of his max HP. Now at most he can gain a 30% damage bonus through this way, or when he is at 80% max HP. So assuming he is shielded or taking some damage here and there, on average Neuvillette will probably hover around the 60 to 70% range in terms of his max HP, which is usually around 20 to 24% damage bonus. Now of course this does mean that there is some minor variance to his damage, but it is not as significant as you may think. For talent priorities, honestly you just mainly want to level his normal attack, as that is where his charge attack damage is coming from. His elemental skill and burst can be leveled if you want to, as they do still deal some respectable damage because it scales off of his HP. However, in my personal opinion, they are not absolutely necessary to level compared to his normal attack. Transitioning over to builds, let's first get into artifact sets. So for sets, honestly, you really just want to use 4-piece Marchesi Hunter. The 4-piece effect gives an immense crit rate boost, and on top of that, he benefits from the 2 pieces normal and charge attack increase. And when you compare it to other options, it's just generally significantly better. Even against his next best option, which is 4-piece Heart of Depth, it'll still be at least above 5% in a lot of case scenarios, and usually you can even see upwards of 10 or more % increase. However, if you really don't have 4-piece Marchesi Hunter, then yes, you can use 4-piece Heart of Depth, or you can use 2-piece variations of Marchesi Hunter, HP %, and Hydro damage bonus. But honestly, whenever you can, just try to get a decent 4-piece on him, and it'll honestly be the best option for you. For main sets, there's 3 different pathways that you can actually take with the main stat department. So you can either do an HP Hydro crit build, an HP Hydro HP build, or an HP HP crit build. HP Hydro crit is the general build, and in most cases it is the best, but only like by a margin. When it comes to HP Hydro HP, this can get competitive with HP Hydro crit, especially when you take into consideration if you have a lot more crit stats in HP Hydro HP, then that is especially when it becomes competitive. So especially when you take into consideration things like his Constellation 2 that increases his crit damage, those are especially case scenarios where this build path can actually be relatively better than his general one. And then in terms of HP HP crit, although it's only really competitive if you have a lot of crit stats to make up for, as well as damage % in comparison to his HP value, it is easier to obtain because of the fact that you're using an HP goblet rather than a Hydro damage goblet, which is rare to get in artifact domain. In terms of stat priorities, you first obviously want to fulfill his energy requirements, because bursting does matter because of the fact that it gives droplets, and droplets are a main mechanic to how you use his charge attack animations, so you definitely want to build enough energy to burst every rotation first, and then you mainly can focus on HP and crit, as those are the only two stats that in my personal opinion are truly relevant to Neuvillette's gameplay. So now let's get into weapons, starting with his best in slot weapon, which gives a crit damage stat and gives a lot of benefits in the passive effect like a charge attack damage increase, as well as some energy for Neuvillette. Now when you compare it to a highly refined Sacrificial Jade, it is a marginal difference, but at R1 Sac Jade, and compared to even just other weapons, it is above 20% in damage increase, and overall is just literally his best weapon option by a landslide. So if you don't think you're going to get refinements on Sacrificial Jade and you are considering getting his weapon, I personally would highly recommend getting it if you can. Next up is Sacrificial Jade. Even at R1, it is outright his second best option in terms of the weapon department, and especially once you get it to higher refinements, and notably at R5, although it doesn't outperform his best in slot, it does become competitive with it to the point where the difference becomes more marginal. Next up is Woodsith at high refinements. It's a decent general weapon, especially with the crit damage stat, although he only really benefits from 1/3 of the buffs unless you're in a team where he's triggering the reaction, then he can benefit from the Elemental Mastery portion, but otherwise he's mainly only going to benefit from the damage bonus portion. That's the only downside with the passive effect, and also the fact that its cooldown is relatively long. Next up is Prototype Amber. Now this is his best free-to-play weapon, but also just a decently good weapon in general, as it gives HP percent and also gives some healing and energy generation after using your elemental burst. So if you don't have any of the above mentioned options, then honestly you can just rock a Prototype Amber. And outside of these ones, any other crit or HP weapon works fine with them. You can use Jade Fall Splendor if, God forbid, you have that weapon, Lost Prayer, or even like Kagura's Verity. Any of those choices can just work with them. Now next, let's discuss Neuvillette's Constellation 1, because it is a relatively significant constellation to Neuvillette, but it's more of a it depends scenario. So the thing about his C1 is that it does give him interruption resistance and gives an extra stack for his Ascension 1 passive, meaning that you only need to trigger 2 additional reactions to cap out on his stacks. Now this is notably significant, especially if you're using them in teams that only give 2 stacks. Because you get that extra stack, you can play teams that only give 2 stacks but still get max stacks, and you'll see a notable increase in your damage output. This is also good for people who just prefer to use more offensive supports and don't want to have to use a shielder or some form of defensive utility for every single, abyss run that they do. So now into unit synergies. So Farina is definitely a unit that synergizes quite well with him. Not only does she enable double hydro, but she also gives damage percent buffs in her elemental burst, and also does a decent amount of damage off field. And on top of that, Neuvillette can actually stack Fanfare relatively well because of his HP drain and gain. He loses 48% of his max HP at most when he's consistently above 50% HP, and then on top of that, his droplets heal him for another 48%. So he's constantly fluctuating between HP levels, which allows for more Fanfare to stack over time. Next up is any animo units like Kazuha, Venti, honestly anyone that swirls, both for the VV effect, but especially in the case of Kazuha and Venti. Both of them provide some crowd control. Venti in his own accord specifically helps with energy alleviation, while with Kazuha, he's more on the damage percent buffing type side. Shielders are also really valuable to Neuvillette, especially at C0, because Neuvillette, when he is in his charge attack state, is relatively vulnerable because, well, you have to sit there and hold and move around. So having a shielder gives you less concern about whether or not you're taking damage or not. So characters like Zhongli, Layla, or Diana, especially in the early game with Diana, or if you have her high constellations, are relatively valuable for Neuvillette. And this also goes for characters that give some form of interruption resistance or minor shields. So things like Beta with her elemental burst works really well, especially if you want to do a taser type team with Neuvillette. There's also Dehya, and there's also Baiju if you're doing a Fridge or a Bloom type team, you can also use him. And then a more niche synergy, it's niche because it's not necessarily something that I would say you want to do, but you can do it because it's funny. But it's Tartaglia, because of the fact that Tartaglia increases the talent level of your normal attack by 1. So especially if you have a level 9 or a level 10 talent level, then Tartaglia can just increase the level by himself like that. So it's a little niche and not necessarily the automatic go-to, but it's something that you can do if you want to type thing. So now getting into teams, so he can honestly play a wide variety of teams. So he can be used in things like a hyper carry team. You can play him in a Bloom or a Fridge type team. You can play him in a Freeze archetype. You can play him in a Hyper Bloom archetype. You can play him in Vape. You can play him in Taser. He actually has a decent selection of team varieties simply because of the fact that he's a Hydra unit, but also because of the way that he works. He tends to want more supportive units, but also really does like off-field damage dealers. So he has access to a wide variety of units across multiple teams, even though there are some teams that only give 2 stacks. he still does enough damage to where it's not the worst thing in the world. And for rotations, generally you want to start with his elemental skill. I know there's some rotations where you start with his burst, but I've noticed that when you start rotations with burst, there are some instances where it can be kind of awkward, and usually you can only get 3 charge attacks off if you're doing it well. I don't know, it's sort of an it depends, but for most rotations, it's starting with his elemental skill, then swapping to supports, then doing a hold charge attack, then casting his burst, then doing a hold charge attack and his skill, swapping back to supports, and then doing 2 more hold charge attacks. This way you get 4 charge attacks and 2 skill uses per rotation, and you can consistently repeat this rotation. Of course, again, if you want to, you can start the animation with his elemental burst, but the thing is, he's not like some DPS units where you can start by like casting their skill and then pressing their burst to gain particles after you cast burst immediately after. And because droplets have a 15-second duration, you're going to probably run out of one section of droplets and you're going to miss out on a lot of damage. So droplet management with Neuvillette in rotations is especially important and something that you need to keep in mind when you are doing with them. Now, there's been discussion as to whether Neuvillette is really the best DPS in the game. I've seen this discussion across main servers on Discord as well as in Reddit, both when he was first released and also just current discussions right now. And I've seen some videos talking about it, how they really don't think that he's considered the best DPS given certain circumstances. I also kind of agree that I would not necessarily say he is the best DPS, but he's definitely gotten better, especially with the addition of Farina. And I think when you take into account the fact that he is at super high investment, so like if you have his weapon or you're using C1 in like a double hydro Farina team with like Kazuha Zhongli, for example, or just any high investment team at that level for that matter, then it can be a little bit more debatable and I'll be a bit more agreeable on the side that he would be the best DPS. But when you're looking at an average Neuvillette that's like C0, probably maybe has Sac Jade at like R1 or even like maybe a couple refinements, realistically he's going to perform similarly to other DPS units, and especially when you take into account single target. You have to understand that his charge attacks do 8 ticks of damage. While this is really great in AoE because it can hit multiple enemies at one time, when it's in single target, it's just on one enemy, and compared to a DPS like, say, Hu Tao, for example, who especially excels in single target scenarios, it is not like he is completely outclassing. But I think another reason why he is a character that, I don't know if overrated is the right term to use for what I'm trying to explain here, but gets a lot of praise for his performance is also mainly because of the fact that he consolidates a lot of his damage very easily, because you just have to press his skill button and then hold the charge attack button and then you just water cannon. And then you just sit there and hold. And it's very easy to do, which makes it very relaxing for players across all skill levels, both those who are really mechanically well-versed, as well as players who are either newer or just aren't necessarily as mechanically well-versed. And so I think for a lot of players, when especially, again, compared to someone like Hu Tao, where you have to learn combos like N1C or like N2-C, N2C, whatever her N2C dash combo is, you have to like kind of learn combos and then get decent at it to do well with it. And I feel like some players might value the comfort, or I guess the ease of playability of characters in some situations. And then on top of that, him being able to do a lot of damage on top of that is something that I think a lot of people just tend to value a lot. So I think that's why he gets the praise that he gets. But I do agree that I would not necessarily say he's the best DPS ever and should like and like completely outclasses everyone. He's really, really strong, don't get me wrong. He's definitely like top 3 easily in my books personally in terms of the DPS class, but outside of really high investment, he then kind of just submerges and becomes at the same level of pretty much every other Of course, this is me, although trying to speak somewhat objectively, am a little bit subjective as well. So it's not necessarily to say that what I'm saying is outright the true answer. Everyone has a different outlook, or I guess opinion, on how they view Neuvillette. At the end of the day, what is objectively true is that he is a really strong DPS unit, and if you value a strong DPS unit that is very easy to play, then I would say that it's fine to get him, because he's just really good, and also he's a really cool character, so that's fine. And alright, that's all I've got to say on this Neuvillette guide. If you guys enjoy it, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more Genshin Impact content, and until the next video, bye bye.